Welcome to East and West Season 4, an audiobook presentation of Undine by Friedrich de la Motte Fouqué. If you are joining us for the first time, I strongly advise starting Season 4 at the beginning with Season 4, Episode 1. Today's episode is Undine Chapter 2. In Chapter 1, we met the old fisherman and his wife and learned that 15 years back they lost their infant child to the lake. The couple then found at their doorstep a lost 3-year-old girl all alone who called herself Undine. They adopted her, and she is now 18. In the midst of this situation, a knight named Huldbrand comes riding from the forest and is introduced to Undine. The girl, in a fit, disappears into the woods, and at the end of Chapter 1, Huldbrand and the old fisherman are going out into the stormy night to find her. And now for Undine Chapter 2. The longer Huldbrand sought Undine beneath the shades of night and failed to find her, the more anxious and confused he became. The impression that she was a mere phantom of the forest gained a new ascendancy over him. Indeed, amid the howling of the waves and the tempest, the crashing of the trees, and the entire change of the once so peaceful and beautiful scene, he was tempted to view the whole peninsula together with the cottage and its inhabitants as little more than some mockery of the senses. But still he heard afar off the fisherman's anxious and incessant shouting, "Undine!" and also his aged wife, who was praying and singing psalms. At length, when he drew near to the brook which had overflowed its banks, he perceived by the moonlight that it had taken its wild course directly in front of the haunted forest, so as to change the peninsula into an island. "Merciful God," he breathed to himself, "if Undine has ventured a step within that fearful wood, what will become of her? Perhaps it was all owing to her sportive and wayward spirit, because I would give her no account of my adventures there. And now a stream is rolling between us. She may be weeping alone on the other side in the midst of spectral horrors." A shuddering groan escaped him, and clambering over some stones and trunks of overthrown pines in order to step into the impetuous current, he resolved, either by wading or swimming, to seek the wanderer on the further shore. He felt, it is true, all the dread and shrinking awe creeping over him, which he had already suffered by daylight among the now tossing and roaring branches of the forest. More than all, a tall man in white, whom he knew but too well, met his view, as he stood grinning and nodding on the grass beyond the water. But even monstrous forms like this only impelled him to cross over toward them, when the thought rushed upon him that Undine might be there alone, and in the agony of death. He had already grasped a strong branch of a pine and stood supporting himself upon it in the whirling current, against which he could with difficulty keep himself solid. But he advanced deeper with a courageous spirit. That instant a gentle voice of warning cried near him, "Oh, do not venture that old man. The stream is too full of tricks to be trusted." He knew the soft tones of the voice, and while he stood, as it were, entranced beneath the shadows, which had now duskily veiled the moon, his head swam with the swelling and rolling of the waves as he saw them momentarily rising above his knee. Still, he disdained the thought of giving up his purpose. "If you are not really there, if you are merely gambolling round me like a mist, may I, too, bid farewell to life, and become a shadow like you, dear, dear Undine." Thus calling aloud, he again moved deeper into the stream. "Look round you, pray look round you, beautiful young stranger. Why rush on death so madly?" cried the voice a second time close by him. And looking on one side, he perceived by the light of the moon, again cloudless, a little island formed by the flood, and crouching upon its flowery turf, beneath the branches of embowering trees, he saw the smiling and lovely Undine. Oh, how much more gladly than before the young man now plied his sturdy staff. A few steps and he had crossed the flood that was rushing between himself and the maiden, and he stood near her on the little spot of greensward in security, protected by the old trees. Undine half rose, and she threw her arms around his neck to draw him gently down upon the soft seat by her side. "Yes, here you shall tell me your story, my beautiful friend," she breathed in a low whisper. "Here the cross old people cannot disturb us, and besides our roof of leaves here will make quite as good a shelter as their poor cottage." "It is heaven itself," cried Huldbrand, and folding her in his arms, he kissed the lovely girl with fervor. The old fisherman, meantime, had come to the margin of the stream, and he shouted across, "Why, how is this, Sir Knight? I received you with the welcome which one true-hearted man gives to another, and now you sit there caressing my foster-child in secret, while you suffer me in my anxiety to wander through the night in quest of her?" "Not till this moment did I find her myself, old father," cried the knight across the water. "So much the better," said the fisherman. "But now make haste and bring her over to me upon firm ground." To this, however, Undine would by no means consent. She declared that she would rather enter the wild forest itself with the beautiful stranger than return to the cottage where she was so thwarted in her wishes, and from which the knight would soon or late go away. Then, throwing her arms round Huldbrand, she sang the following verse with the warbling sweetness of a bird. "Real would leave its misty veil, and fortune's wild explore. Weary at length it reached the main, and sought its veil no more." The old fisherman wept bitterly at her song, but his emotion seemed to awaken little or no sympathy in her. She kissed and caressed her new friend, who at last said to her, "Undine, if the distress of the old man does not touch your heart, it cannot but move mine. We ought to return to him." She opened her large blue eyes upon him in amazement, and spoke at last with a slow and doubtful accent. "Well, if you think so, it is well, and all is right with me, which you think right, but the old man over there must first give me his promise that he will allow you, without objection, to relate what you saw in the wood, and, well, other things will settle themselves." "Come! Only come!" cried the fisherman to her, unable to utter another word, and at the same time he stretched his arms wide over the current towards her, and to give her assurance that he would do what she required, nodded his head. This motion caused his white hair to fall strangely over his face, and Huldbrand could not but remember the nodding white man of the forest. Without allowing anything, however, to produce in him the least confusion, the young knight took the beautiful girl in his arms and bore her across the narrow channel which the stream had torn away between her little island and the solid shore. The old man fell upon Undine's neck and found it impossible either to express his joy or to kiss her enough. Even the ancient dame came up and embraced the recovered girl more cordially. Every word of censure was carefully avoided, the more so, indeed, as even Undine, forgetting her waywardness, almost overwhelmed her foster parents with caresses and the prattle of tenderness. When at length the excess of their joy at recovering their child had subsided, morning had already dawned, shining upon the waters of the lake. The tempest had become hushed, the small birds sung merrily on the moist branches. As Undine now insisted upon hearing the recital of the knight's promised adventures, the aged couple readily agreed to her wish. Breakfast was brought out beneath the trees, which stood behind the cottage toward the lake on the north, and they sat down to it with contented hearts, Undine at the knight's feet on the grass. These arrangements being made, Huldbrand began his story in the following manner. "It is now about 8 days since I rode into the free imperial city which lies yonder on the farther side of the forest. Soon after my arrival a splendid tournament and running at the ring took place there, and I spared neither my horse nor my lance in the encounters. Once, while I was pausing at the list to rest from the brisk exercise, and was handing back my helmet to one of the attendants, a female figure of extraordinary beauty caught my attention. As most magnificently attired, she stood looking on at one of the balconies. I learned, on making inquiry of a person near me, that the name of the young lady was Bertalda, and that she was a foster daughter of one of the powerful dukes of the country. She, too, I observed, was gazing at me, and the consequences were such as we young knights are wont to experience. Whatever success in riding I might have had before, I was now favored with still better fortune. That evening I was Bertalda's partner in the dance, and I enjoyed the same distinction during the remainder of the festival." A sharp pain in Huldbrand's left hand, as it hung carelessly beside him, here interrupted his relation, and drew his eye to the part affected. Undine had fastened her pearly teeth, and not without some keenness too, upon one of his fingers, appearing at the same time very gloomy and displeased. On a sudden, however, she looked up in his eyes with an expression of tender melancholy, and whispered almost inaudibly, "Well, it is all your fault." She then covered her face, and the knight, strangely embarrassed and thoughtful, went on with his story. "This lady, Bertalda, of whom I spoke, is of a proud and wayward spirit. The second day I saw her, she pleased me by no means so much as she had the first, and the third day still less. But I continued about her because she showed me more favor than she did any other knight, and it so happened that I playfully asked her to give me one of her gloves. 'When you have entered the haunted forest alone,' said she, 'when you have explored its wonders and brought me a full account of them, the glove is yours.' As to getting her glove, it was of no importance to me whatever, but the word had been spoken, and no honorable knight would permit himself to be urged to such a proof of valor a second time." "I thought," said Undine, interrupting him, "that she loved you." "It did appear so," replied Huldbrand. "Well," exclaimed the maiden, laughing, "this is beyond belief. She must be very stupid to drive from her the one who was dear to her, and worse than all, into that ill-omened wood. The wood and its mysteries, for all I should have cared, might have waited long enough." "Yesterday morning, then," pursued the knight, smiling kindly upon Undine, "I set out from the city, my enterprise before me. The early light lay rich upon the verdant turf. It shone so rosy on the slender boles of the trees, and there was so merry a whispering among the leaves, that in my heart I could not but laugh at people who feared meeting anything to terrify them in a spot so delicious. 'I shall soon pass through the forest, and as speedily return,' I said to myself, in the overflow of joyous feelings. And ere I was well aware, I had entered deep among the green shades, while of the plain that lay behind me I was no longer able to catch a glimpse. Then the conviction for the first time impressed me that in a forest of so great extent I might very easily become bewildered, and that this, perhaps, might be the only danger which was likely to threaten those who explored its recesses. So I made a halt, and turned myself in the direction of the sun, which had meantime risen somewhat higher, and while I was looking up to observe it, I saw something black among the boughs of a lofty tree. My first thought was, 'It is a bear,' and I grasped my weapon. The object then accosted me from above in a human voice, but in a tone most harsh and hideous. 'If I, overhead here, do not gnaw off these dry branches, Sir Noodle, what shall we have to roast you with when midnight comes?' And with that it grinned and made such a rattling with the branches that my courser became mad with affright, and rushed furiously forward with me before I had time to see distinctly what sort of a devil's beast it was. 'You must not speak so,' said the old fisherman, crossing himself. His wife did the same without saying a word, and Undine, while her eyes sparkled with delight, looked at the knight and said, 'The best of the story is, however, that as yet they have not roasted you. Go on now, you beautiful knight.' The knight then went on with his adventures. My horse was so wild that he well nigh rushed with me against limbs and trunks of trees. He was dripping with sweat through terror, heat, and the violent straining of his muscles. Still he refused to slacken his career. At last, altogether beyond my control, he took his course directly up a stony steep, when suddenly a tall, white man flashed before me, and threw himself athwart the way my mad steed was taking. At this apparition he shuddered with new affright, and stopped, trembling. I took this chance of recovering my command of him, and now for the first time perceived that my deliverer, so far from being a white man, was only a brook of silver brightness, foaming near me in the descent from the hill, while it crossed and arrested my horse's course with its rush of waters. 'Oh, thanks, dear brook!' cried Undine, clapping her little hands. But the old man shook his head, and looked down in deep thought. Hardly had I well settled myself in my saddle, and got the reins in my grasp again, Huldbrand pursued, when a wizard-like dwarf of a man was already standing at my side, diminutive and ugly beyond conception, his complexion of a brownish yellow, and his nose scarcely smaller than the rest of him together. The fellow's mouth was slit almost from ear to ear, and he showed his teeth with a grinning smile of idiot courtesy, while he overwhelmed me with bows and scrapes innumerable. The farce now becoming excessively irksome, I thanked him in the fewest words I could well use, turned about my still trembling charger, and purposed either to seek another adventure, or, should I meet with none, to take my way back to the city. For the sun, during my wild chase, had passed the meridian, and was now hastening toward the west. But this villain of a dwarf sprang at the same instant, and with a turn as rapid as lightning stood before my horse again. "Clear the way there!" I cried furiously. "The beast is wild, and will make nothing of running over you." "Hi, hi!" cried the imp with a snarl, and snorting out a laugh, still more frightfully idiotic. "Pay me first, pay me what you owe me. I stopped your fine little nag for you. Without my help, both you and he would now be sprawling below there in that stony ravine. From what a horrible plunge I've saved you!" "Well, don't make any more faces," said I, "but take your money and be off, though every word you say is false. It was the brook there, you miserable thing, and not you, that saved me." And at the same time I dropped a piece of gold into his wizard cap, which he had taken from his head while he was begging before me. I then trotted off and left him, but he screamed after me, and on a sudden, with inconceivable quickness, he was close by my side. I started my horse into a gallop. The dwarf galloped on with me, though it seemed with great difficulty and with a strange movement, half ludicrous and half horrible, forcing at the same time every limb and feature into distortion. He held up the gold piece and screamed at every step, "Counterfeit! False coin! Counterfeit!" And such was the strange sound that issued from his hollow breast, you would have supposed that at every scream he must have tumbled upon the ground dead. All this while his disgusting red tongue hung lolling from his mouth. I stopped, bewildered, and asked, "What do you mean by this screaming? Take another piece of gold, take two, but leave me." He then began his hideous salutations of courtesy, and snarled out as before, "Not gold! It shall not be gold, my young gentleman. I have too much of that trash already, as I will show you in no time." At that moment, and thought itself could not have been more instantaneous, I seemed to have acquired new powers of sight. I could see through the solid green plain as if it were green glass, and the smooth surface of the earth were round as a globe, and within it I saw crowds of goblins, who were pursuing their pastime and making themselves merry with silver and gold. They were tumbling and rolling about, heads up and heads down. They pelted one another in sport with the precious metals, and with irritating malice blew gold dust in one another's eyes. My odious companion ordered the others to reach him up a vast quantity of gold. This he showed to me with a laugh, and then flung it again, ringing and clinking, down the measureless abyss. After this contemptuous disregard of gold, he held up the piece I had given him, showing it to his brother goblins below, and they laughed immoderately at a coin so worthless, and hissed me. At last, raising their fingers, all smutched with ore, they pointed them at me in scorn. And wilder, and thicker, and madder, the crowd were clamoring up to where I sat, gazing at these wonders. Then terror seized me, as it had before seized my horse. I drove my spurs into his sides, and how far he rushed with me through the forest during this second of my wild heats, it is impossible to say. At last, when I had come to a dead halt again, the cool of evening was around me. I caught the gleam of a white footpath through the branches of the trees, and presuming it would lead me out of the forest toward the city, I was desirous of working my way into it. But a face, perfectly white and indistinct, with features ever changing, kept thrusting itself out and peering at me between the leaves. I tried to avoid it, but wherever I went, there too appeared the unearthly face. I was maddened with rage at this interruption, and determined to drive my steed at the appearance full tilt, when such a cloud of white foam came rushing upon me and my horse that we were almost blinded, and glad to turn about and escape. Thus, from step to step, it forced us on and ever aside from the footpath, leaving us for the most part only one direction open. When we advanced in this, it kept following close behind us, yet did not occasion the smallest harm or inconvenience. When, at times, I looked about me at the form, I perceived that the white face, which had splashed upon its shower of foam, was resting on a body equally white and of more than gigantic size. Many a time, too, I received the impression that the whole appearance was nothing more than a wandering stream or torrent. But respecting this, I could never attain any certainty. We both of us, horse and rider, became weary as we shaped our course according to the movements of the white man. who continued nodding his head at us, as if he would say, "Quite right." And thus at length we came out here in the edge of the wood, where I saw the fresh turf, the waters of the lake, and your little cottage, and where the tall white man disappeared. "Well, heaven be praised that he's gone," cried the old fisherman, and he now began to talk of how his guest could most conveniently return to his friends in the city. Upon this, Undine began laughing to herself, but so very low that the sound was hardly perceivable. Huldbrand, observing it, said, "I thought you were glad to see me here. Why then do you now appear so happy when our talk turns upon my going away?" "Because you cannot go away," answered Undine. "Pray make a single attempt. Try with a boat, with your horse, or alone as you please to cross that forest stream which has burst its bounds, or rather make no trial at all, for you would be dashed to pieces by the stones and trunks of trees which you see driven on with such violence. And as to the lake, I know that well. Even my father dares not venture out with his boat far enough to help you." Huldbrand rose, smiling in order to look about and observe whether the state of things were such as Undine had represented it to be. The old man accompanied him, and the maiden went merrily dancing beside them. They found all, in fact, just as Undine had said, and that the knight, whether willing or not willing, must submit to remaining on the island, so lately a peninsula, until the flood should subside. When the three were now returning to the cottage after their ramble, the knight whispered in the ear of the little maiden, "Well, dear Undine, are you angry at my remaining?" She pettishly replied, "Do not speak to me. If I had not bitten you, who knows what fine things you would have put into your story about Bertalda." A few thoughts after Chapter 2. What must it be like to live on the edge of an enchanted wood, a dark and dangerous forest, a fearful mystery? Yet the fisherman and his wife have made their peaceful lodging on the lake right by the haunted wood. To read this symbolically, it is a fairy tale after all. How might our lives, peaceful lake shores carved out of surrounding turmoil, also be ever shadowed by a great and fearful mystery looming just on our borders? As Pastor Louis Giglio of Passion City Church in Atlanta illustrates in his latest book, Don't Give the Enemy a Seat at Your Table, when the 23rd Psalm, which speaks of green pastures and still waters, says, "You prepare a table before me," notice where the table is. In the presence of my enemies. Perhaps they are all around the table. Enemies, the enemy, looking for a chance to pull up a chair. God does not remove from us trouble, but He gives us green pastures, still waters, and a feast at a table for two amid them all. A word also on the knight, Huldbrand, a symbol of courage. He willfully enters the forest and willfully seeks his adventures, goblins and strange white apparitions and all. And this, it seems, solely at the request of a lady, Bertalda, whom he meets in the city on the other side of the wood. Undine, much like Tinker Bell with Peter Pan, is showing real signs of jealousy for this Bertalda. At Huldbrand's first mentioning of the name, Undine bites him on the hand. I hope you'll join us for the next episode, Chapter 3. Until then, press on, everybody.